Welcome to our webinar on modern slavery and decent work. Since last October, we organized 12 webinars on human trafficking in the light of the Laudato Si and Fratelli Tutti encyclicals. Allow me to show you two quotes from these encyclicals. First, Laudato Si, and you see every effort to protect and improve our world entails profound changes in lifestyles, models of production and consumption, and the established structures of power which govern today's society. Authentic human development has a moral character. It presumes full respect of the human person, and then to say that these problems are closely linked to a throwaway culture which affects the excluded just as it quickly reduces things, and I would add persons, to rubbish. And Fratelli Tutti, and you see that also a quote, paragraph 24, trafficking in persons and other contemporary forms of enslavement are a worldwide problem that needs to be taken seriously by humanity as a whole, since criminal organizations employ global networks to achieve their goals. Efforts to eliminate this phenomenon also demand a common and indeed a global effort on the part of various sectors of society. And actually, since October, we organized 12 webinars. And in our 12 webinars, we highlighted the importance of the work of religious congregations in advocacy and assistance to human trafficking victims and survivors at the local and international level. We discussed the trauma inflicted on victims and how to deal with trauma with professionals. We examined legal and criminal approaches to human trafficking, understood the limits of criminal prosecution, and underlined the need to develop a legal framework to address the demand for goods and services produced by slave labor. We described solutions such as the Nordic model and the need to help women escape prostitution, to prosecute pimps, joints, but not prostitutes. We discussed the role of consumers, how to educate them and encourage producers to strictly control their supply chains. We heard witnesses on the role of technology facilitating human trafficking, technology misused by human traffickers during all stages of the crime, including recruitment, control, and exploitation of victims, as well as technology used to prevent and combat human trafficking. Modern slavery, the opposite of decent work, is on the rise. Nearly everything we consume, from clothing to the batteries in our cell phones to the fish we eat, has forced labor and exploitation hidden somewhere inside its production. Many of us, including the businesses who make the products we buy, have no idea when or where the exploitation occurs. And it's growing every single day. About 45.8 million people today are living in slave-like conditions. That's bigger than the population of California, Canada, or Argentina. Every country on earth is affected. And more than $150 billion in profits are generated annually by businesses employing slavery and exploitation. This is bigger than the revenues of Google, Microsoft, Apple, ExxonMobil, and JP Morgan Chase combined. Today, we shall discuss this cohort of our time with experts. And agriculture provides jobs for more than 1 billion people globally, yet millions of farmers and farm workers don't earn enough to pay for their basics like decent food, housing, and education, let alone save for unexpected setbacks or for a dignified retirement. 70% of the more than 152 million children in child labor are working in agriculture. The race to the bottom on prices, particularly in coffee, cocoa, and bananas, means the risk of child and adult exploitation gets worse. Consequently, young people are leaving farming communities in droves, often ending up in informal and insecure work in cities or on larger farms. This year's World Day Against Child Labor focuses on action taken for the 2021 International Year for the Elimination of Child Labor. This is the first World Day since the universal ratification of the ILO Convention 182 on the worst forms of child labor. It takes place at a time when the COVID-19 crisis threatens to reverse years of progress in tackling the problem. According to the ILO, International Labour Organization, decent work is productive work for women and men in conditions of freedom, equity, security, and human dignity. In general, work is considered as decent when 1. It pays a fair income. 2. It guarantees a secure form of employment and safe working conditions. 3. It ensures equal opportunities and treatment for all. 4. It includes social protection for the workers and their families. 5. It offers prospects for personal development and encourages social integration. And 6, workers are free to express their concerns and to organize. And to summarize, decent work sums up the aspirations of people in their working lives. And productive employment and decent work are key elements to achieving a fair globalization and a poverty reduction. And now, allow me to thank today's speakers. First will be Brian Iselin on the need to check supply chains in order to reduce and get rid of slave labor. Second, Cristina Duranti, who shall speak about her experience preventing and combating the exploitation of children forced to work in mines in Africa and elsewhere. Third, Andrea Marchesani, who shall speak on the social teaching of the Catholic Church on decent work and modern slavery based on the pastoral orientations. Then Gabriele Spina, helping migrants in Italy to escape slave labor and training them to integrate towards decent work. The last speaker, Professor Marc Chesney, who teaches finance at Zurich University in Switzerland, shall take a broader view of today's economic system that too often leads to undermine real economy and decent work. So thanks to all. And just a word, you could find documents, including the ILO UNICEF report and other documents in the handouts of this webinar. Feel free to download and share them. And I would also like to thank Sister Miriam Baike, co-organizer of this webinar, representative at the UN in Geneva for the Sisters of Our Good Lady of Charity of the Good Shepherd, who worked 30 years with survivors of trafficking in Germany and Albania, and who shall now take over as moderator of this webinar. Miriam, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michel. So we just start to go in medias res, and I give the word to Brian to make like an introduction and explain more what it is about. Many of you know him already. He is a former Australian soldier and federal agent, the founder of a Geneva-based slave-free trade, a non-profit working on leveraging the might of the blockchain to rid the world of slave labor. Brian, you have the floor.
Thanks so much for having me again, Sister Miriam and Michelle. So as I hope everybody can hear me okay. As Sister Miriam said, in my former lives, I've been a soldier and a federal agent. I specialized in counter-organized crime and counterintelligence for 19 years. And then for the last 19 years, my life has been longer than I look, right? I have specialized in conducting operations against slavery around the world. And all of this time, I learned one thing, which is very, very important, is to quickly work out what is and stay focused on the actual problem, not perceived problems, but the actual problem. And so let me explain from a human trafficking, modern slavery perspective and a criminal justice perspective. When you're confronted by someone with a knife and a bad attitude towards you, the problem is actually not the knife in the hand. The real problem is the guy behind it. The knife actually becomes a distraction and not the problem. Because I can neutralize the knife, but the guy behind it will still be there. And so will the bad attitude, which means he will just look for another way to do what he was going to do anyway. This is called the displacement effect. And it means the problem is treated, but not cured. And that, the displacement, is exactly what we're doing and have been doing for decades on modern slavery and human trafficking. So in talking about sustainability in business, and given this knife analogy, let's talk about what really is the problem confronting all of us here for just a second. It's not poverty. It's not sexual abuse. It's not gender. It's not unemployment, migration, documented or otherwise. The problem confronting us is someone who makes the moral and economic choice to exploit the labor of someone else. This right here is the essence of what we talk about when we say the demand side of the equation. Someone making a premeditated or opportunistic decision to exploit someone else for their labor, and in so doing denies them the decent work that Michelle was describing before. Now, the person behind this decision, the one behind this knife, is what we're looking at when we're trying to address the demand side. And importantly, in context, more than 98% of global spending on modern slavery is spent on the supply side of the equation, the displacement side of the equation. So the problem for anyone addressing modern slavery is how to account for business people who don't find a place for intrinsic good in their business and abuse human rights because it doesn't hurt their business to do so. This is how I came to create Slave-Free Trade 4 years ago, born out of, let's say, frustration and futility. After years of disarming people only to find them doing it all over and over again, I thought, this is wrong. We need a systemic response to this systemic problem. And so let's address the actual problem. Instead of treating and displacing only, let's see if we can't invest in a cure. Now, it's very important to remember, slavers and exploiters are not all hardcore. I've met many over the years. They're not all complete ratbags. Lots of them are just opportunistic users of people, like so many of the world's population. Let's face facts. We can actually take a lot of them out of the business of slaving by giving them something more positive to strive for. And some of you will find this a cynical view, but our solutions can't be just, or can't actually be, focused on the intrinsic good. It still needs to boil down to money. We can give these slavers and exploiters a better place to be, but in fact, it needs to be a better market to be. They need to want to go there for self-motivated and commercial reasons. So that means a completely new way of thinking about modern slavery. It means reconceptualizing human rights in workplaces and building a new economic model that advantages your business if you respect human rights. But the central question for me in setting up slave-free trade was how to make respecting decent work pay. And what would a market look like in which you can't participate if you're not up to do that? So to ensure decent work in more workplaces globally, we need to create this economic model that says your human rights performance is not alongside, it's not part of a triple bottom line, it's part and parcel of your bottom line, effectively taking market forces back on themselves to reinforce good behavior. And clearly we're not talking about a small exercise. As Michelle indicated before, we're talking about tens of millions, hundreds of millions of children in child labor and adults in forced labor. Thanks to COVID, I think we've all come to realize how often we touch our faces in a day. But in fact, we touch slavery more often than we touch our face in a day. From your morning cup of coffee to iPhones, shampoos, and mascara. When you think about COVID and touching your face, it's a very powerful image to realize how often you touch slavery. I very quickly came to realize in trying to come up with such a system that we have to be able to scale massively, which means that we need to be able to automate, again, massively. And so that means tech. Every audit and certification scheme in the world, look at fair trade, for example, has pushed up against this barrier. If you cannot automate, you cannot scale. If you can't scale, you can never come even within radar distance of solving a problem of these dimensions. What we actually need to do is stop focusing on the negative. Slave-free trade is a completely positivist approach. We need to stop relying on meddling at the murky end of the human rights spectrum, because the only way to detect what's happening at the worst end is with people like me going out and investigating. And that has a role to play, but that can never be automated and that can never be scaled. So it's always going to be very small stuff. And you just have to look at the number of prosecutions in the world for trafficking to realize that it's really small stuff. So think this way. Human rights in workplaces, globally, universally, they exist on a spectrum. So what happens if we shift our focus, lifting our gaze instead of at the dark end of the spectrum, looking to cure instead of treatment? What would a global vaccination program look like? The human rights in workplaces are on this spectrum. At one end of the spectrum is this murky pool called modern slavery. And in this reconceptualization, this new look at human rights and modern slavery, you can forget for now all the legal definitions that make it up. You don't actually need, on a personal level, to be able to legally distinguish between forced labor and human trafficking. This is a rabbit hole so many people get stuck on. It makes little to no difference to the victim, and it makes little to no difference if we're talking about shifting our focus, lifting our focus to the positive end of the spectrum. The murky, fetid pool at the bottom is characterized by low respect for human rights. Either a few rights extremely eroded, or lots of them could be. In any case, we can just know that life is pretty crappy at that end of the spectrum. At the far right of the spectrum is that heavenly, delicious place with fountains of warm, flowing, slave-free chocolate. Now that's decent work. But decent work is at the opposite end of the same spectrum as modern slavery. And what we need to do is prove a culture of respect for human rights in a workplace. We prove that a workplace is closer to the decent work end. And in so doing, without even thinking about it, we have disproved the existence of modern slavery. Because decent work and modern slavery, they're opposite ends of the same spectrum. They're like kryptonite to each other. They don't coexist. But more than that, all human rights issues, whether gender pay gap, forced labor, racial discrimination, they all arise out of a culture. Modern slavery is never a one-off in a workplace. You identify the culture, you can identify the issue. Map the culture, and you start to be able to weed out the issues. And the further towards the decent work end of the spectrum a workplace is, the less likely human rights issues are present. So that's what we needed to do. So to make this examination of workplaces possible, we first needed a standard to define decent work and the modern slavery spectrum. It might not surprise you to learn that just 4 years ago when I first started slave-free trade, an effective framework that could be operationalized and defined decent work in real life didn't exist. We had to start it. We had to do it. So the first 2 years we spent doing that. We decided also at that point on principle that any such framework needed to be universal. I hope you will agree with me when I say that it is completely unsatisfactory for any model that says a plantation worker in one country should work in a workplace with a lower human rights standard than a high street retail worker in England or a banker in New York. We have a huge body of international human rights law, and our rights are universally agreed. We don't need new law. And yet, despite the presence of this agreed international law on the matter, it's a sad characteristic, let's say, of the global business world, that the agreed international body of law is a day-to-day irrelevance. I'm here to tell you, I've heard from thousands of businesses, they just say human rights is not on their agenda. But one of the reasons for this irrelevance is that it's so esoteric, as you all know. It's not operational. If you think most organizations understand their international human rights obligations, if you go in to ask someone at H&M their international human rights obligations, you'll find about 2 people know. You're seriously deluded if you think workplaces or businesses understand this. And if you think they have the means to operationalize human rights treaties, completely mistaken. And we need to bring something into reality, something very operational, to make businesses understand what we actually mean by human rights in workplaces. So we decided on a universal operational definition and framework. And so we picked all of the points of existing, universally agreed international human rights law that relate to workplaces' rights and conditions. As I said, we don't need new law. All the rights are there, actually, in the international framework. And so we arrived at a set of 10 principles for decent work, ranging from no forced labor to equal pay, no discrimination, occupational health and safety, and so on. And so these 10 principles, they work in a cascading fashion. Underneath each is a handful of human rights conditions. And if you comply well with all of those principles, you have an objectively really good workplace. I like to use the phrase that human rights is the new HR. I mean, it's really what human resources should always have been, right? It's much more important to know that you don't have gender pay gap or racial discrimination in a workplace than it is to know that you've got Nespresso capsules available. So to make it operational, we then had to take a next step, rationalizing these 10 principles that canvass 25 individual human rights issues. But we faced a problem. We need to get it out to those who can tell us what is really going on in a workplace. That means everyone in workplaces needs to be asked, quite simple. Just like I do when I go to investigate. I ask everybody I can how their life is. So under each condition is a handful of indicators. These are the things you look for during an investigation. So we finally arrived at a global set of 100 indicators for a human rights friendly, slave-free workplace. Someone's going to ask me why 100. It's quite simply because 1 is too few and 1,000 is too many to operationalize. So we needed to go well beyond any of the existing certification and audit standards, for example, and social sustainability standards. Every existing standard for this so-called S in the ESG is based entirely on what we could call the corporate view. If you want to look at any existing model of certification, from B Corp to Dow Jones to Global Reporting Initiative, Fair Trade, all of the sustainability ratings agencies, and even the consumer apps that are out there telling you you can smile when you buy that polyester dress, their evidence is pretty much just the corporate view. I'm not saying we don't capture the corporate view, but it has to be corroborated by the people who are in the workplaces. They're ultimately the best arbiter of their conditions. So how do we know what the pie tastes like under the crust? We have to do what almost nobody else does. We ask those who are eating the pie. So at Slave Free Trade, what we do is we have a process. We have a membership model where an organization joins Slave Free Trade to become human rights compliant, to be proved human rights compliant through continuous, all the time, real-time assessment and monitoring against these 100 indicators. Let me summarize 2 important core processes we call values alignment and workforce assessment. Values alignment is the corporate view, making sure a company has all the policy tools it needs to fix things when there's a problem. And workforce assessment is obtaining the individual view. So this is about we ask every single person in every single workplace about their conditions on a continuous monthly basis. So we're getting a real 360-degree view of what's going on in workplaces from the people in the workplace. And we corroborate that against the corporate view.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you very much. And I think it will be also interesting. We have later a time for question and answers. So, so you will be able to answer if there are questions, and I think there will be. So I found it very interesting because you just started with like a background, the systemic response to a systemic problem. And also you said to focus on the positive. It's much better to have human rights at the workplace than that you have some cheap coffee there. So you explained to us the real root cause. And that's very interesting for the beginning. Now we will hear some from the practical work from Dr. Cristina Duranti. She is the director of the Good Shepherd International Foundation. You won the Thomson Reuters Prize and the Stop Slavery Award for the work fighting the exploitation of children forced to work in mines in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I'm happy to hear what you have to tell us to this topic. You have the floor, Cristina.
So thank you again for this very kind invitation to Professor Betty and to Miriam. I'm very interested to share with you what we're learning on this very critical topic for all of us who are involved in development and human rights protection and promotion. So just very briefly, the Good Shepherd International Foundation works with the Good Shepherd Sisters across 37 countries in Asia, Latin America, Africa, and Middle East. We support their missions in some of the most difficult, fragile context in the world. Our focus is on girls, women, and children, and our way of operation, our model of intervention is promoting the integral development of the human being within the context of their communities. I've been invited to share with you our experience starting from what we are doing in DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where we're running this fairly large program. It's one of our largest programs focusing on ASM. ASM stands for artisanal and small-scale mining, and particularly in a region of DRC that it's well known to the world because it provides some of the most coveted raw materials that feed into our industrial systems. Our focus is now particularly on cobalt, the extraction of this very, very coveted mineral for the production of lithium-ion batteries. So you can imagine this has become one of the hot spots of the world in terms of mining, of extraction. I have been invited before to share about child labor in particular, as this is one of the key focus of our work in Kolwezi. We realized when the Good Shepherd Sisters arrived in Kolwezi, the capital of Lualaba, former Katanga province south of DRC, that forced child labor, and particularly the worst forms of child labor as defined by ILO, were really prevalent in these small communities in and around the town of Kolwezi. So we started to address this issue, and in the past 8 years, we have overall brought around 4,000 children out of the mines and support them into formal education through a community development program that involved families and involved communities. However, today, because of the specific focus of the webinar, I wanted to give you a little bit of a more nuanced description of what we've observed in terms of forced labor and modern slavery. Child labor is something that really stood out in the attention of the whole world when we started to work in Kolwezi. Amnesty reported about that. And so it was a very powerful, how can I say, hook to talk about what was going on in these artisanal mining communities. However, what we realized is that child labor is just the tip of the iceberg, particularly when we talk about very extremely fragile economic systems like the one revolving around mining in these communities of a fragile state like DRC. And it is extremely difficult to how can I say, districate and disconnect child labor from the overall labor condition of the communities that live and work in these areas. So I wanted just to trace back why we are talking about forced labor and modern slavery as GSIF, as Good Shepherd International Foundation, and why the sisters got involved in this topic that originally seemed a little bit disconnected from the focus of our work, that is more traditionally revolving around girls' and women's rights. Of course, as all development agencies and also faith-based organizations, we are looking at the priorities of the 2030 agenda, and we know that decent work, employment creation, social protection, and rights at work are a key element to achieve the overall SDGs and the overall agenda. And we are extremely aware that to provide sustainable solutions for our core beneficiaries, women and girls, we need to look at sustainable ways to generate economic growth and to promote economic growth. There's no doubt around that, I think, for everybody. So decent work and economic growth have to go hands in hand. Although generating decent employment, human rights compliant employment for vulnerable groups, especially women and the poorest, those who are most who have more difficulties in being involved in formal work, is extremely delicate, and it's a really, I think, one of the major challenges for those who are involved in development. And we know that the targets we're looking at of the 2030 agenda that we hope to contribute to is, on one end, to support formalization and growth of the so-called migrant small medium enterprises sector, because we know those are probably the models, the economic models that can foster economic inclusion and income generation for the most vulnerable sections of the population that we are looking at. On the other end, talking about specifically target 8.7, we're all committed to eliminate the worst forms of child labor and all child labor in its forms by 2025. I think we're all aware that we are way off track at the moment. We just last week celebrated the week to the World Day Against Child Labor, and we all read the ILO and UNICEF report around the status of child labor elimination, and actually we learned that child labor is on the rise, with 160 million children estimated being involved in child labor. And this is coupled with the fact that we're in the midst of a terrible economic recession. And we get to my point here, the informal economy is probably the sector that is losing more capacity to generate livelihoods. And this is where we're looking at in communities like the ones we are dealing with in Kolwezi, where is the informal economy that supports their livelihoods. So here we get into the midst of the story with what happens in Kolwezi. As I was mentioning to you, there has been let's say quite a bit of research and some advocacy, interesting international advocacy initiative around the presence of children in the supply chain of batteries, starting from Kolwezi DRC with the extraction of cobalt. And that has raised the, let's say, raised the alarm for many big corporations, especially for those 2-3 people, as Brian was saying, who are experts of human rights and business within these corporations. It raised their attention towards the problem of child labor. However, as I was mentioning, we need to look a little bit deeper, because the context we're looking at, it's not how can I say, a black or white context. We're talking of largely informal economies that involve the majority of the population. The extraction of these minerals is done it's estimated to be done between 20 and 40% by so-called artisanal miners. And artisanal mining in this particular area, but for the most part of DRC, is a highly unregulated sector. Still, it provides livelihoods to a very large section of the population. This means that we cannot really look for an employer, a company, to go talk to when we want to address the issue of decent work or slavery conditions or decent pay or safety and security. We're talking of mostly individuals who come together now under the new mining code. They have to come together under the framework of cooperatives, but still their working conditions are extremely volatile, extremely prone to the volatility of the market and of the buyers and those who make the price, let's say. When we went to investigate a little bit closer, what were the working conditions of these artisanal miners in the communities that provide the most amount of minerals within the supply chain of cobalt, what we found resembled a sort of Dickensian picture, like a pre-industrial scenery where a sort of collective action, some ideas of collective bargaining systems, it's still absolutely remote and considered very, very far away. So those that could be considered the embryos, no, the starting points of a process of advocating and lobbying for workers' rights were absolutely absent. And so what we found are conditions where miners are paid, as you can read here, between 0.8 and 50% a day for what they produce. They have no idea what the market price of what they produce is, and they have extremely limited bargaining powers. The conditions that our researchers found on the ground were comparable to what they saw in refugee camps in South Sudan. So taking that as a bar for a benchmark, let's say, for the lowest possible side of the spectrum in terms of labor rights, this was definitely placed at the bottom of the spectrum, at the far end of the spectrum. What were these barriers to decent work in the artisanal and small scale mining sector that we could identify and that we still observe as the key elements that need to be addressed? Definitely there's a lack of education on workers and miners' rights specifically. So even though in DRC there are laws and fairly sophisticated laws that in theory defend the rights of this particular sector of the workforce, they're not well known and they're definitely not enforced. And that results into a total lack of bargaining power of miners. So zero collective capacity to run collective action initiatives. There's a continuous risk of losing this even minimal bargaining power due to a number of issues connected to the ownership of the land where these people mine. They're usually legal in their operation. There's a tolerance of this scores of miners, but there's no actual provision of rights to mine in these areas, although these areas are not used by those who own the concessions. You have to think that mining concessions are the size of a medium Italian region, so they are huge and largely unused. the size of the cooperatives that have been formed and their nature in terms of legal rights and contractual rights is extremely murky and tainted by corruption and collusion with state political forces that prevent any kind of transparency. There's a strong risk of debt relationships between the members of cooperatives and the owners of the cooperatives. So we could not even call them actual cooperatives based on our European standards, let's say. And we've observed that in many cases, the people who work in these mining sites, not just the miners, but also their families that very often live within these mining concessions, have no freedom even to move. And if we cannot define this modern slavery, I don't know what would qualify as modern slavery. As I said, there are extremely strong, but I will not go into details here. Maybe we can go through this during the question time. There are definitely issues related to law enforcement and the difficulty for the government agencies and the police to be an effective support for the rights of these workers, rather the opposite. Corruption and collusion basically pile up against the rights of these workers. What I wanted just to end with, it's a little bit of a glimpse of hope. There are new regulatory systems that are in the making. There are attempts from the DRC government to set up a public-private enterprise that should help let's say, providing better market conditions, as we were talking about incentives for artisan miners to formalize their operations. There are a lot of processes of multilateral agencies and multi-stakeholder initiatives to develop standards for this sector. And we're part of some of them. And it's definitely a very, very hard process to define sector-specific standards from the perspective of human rights protection. And there are initiatives like the ones that we are leading to promote alternative livelihoods based on good models of social business cooperatives that can also set a standard for the local cooperative movement that focuses around decent work and workers' rights. So I will stop here and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Cristina. When I listened to you, what I found very interesting or stood out for me is, in a way, one can say that that a lack of education leads to many other reasons, like you have the lack of bargaining. You know, people have also to learn how to bargain, and or they are unable to report cases. So I think a lot of education will be necessary also to improve the situation, besides all the legally necessary measures that you are involved in. So now, after we have had the first view in the practical work in Democratic Republic of Congo, we will go to Mr. Andrea Marchesani. He is a special advisor of the Order of Malta, the member of the Migrants and Refugees section, and integral human development dicastery of the Holy See. So you have the floor.
Many thanks, Sister Miriam. Good evening to everyone. It's a pleasure for me to intervene tonight, this afternoon, in my capacity as head of research of the Migrants and Refugees section of the OLC. And my duty today is to link. I would like to thank Michelle for the invitation, all the other speakers, and the Order of Malta. And my duties today is to intervene and to talk about the decent labor, and allow me to use the word that in English all the popes used in, or all the documents in every social document of the church, and they use labor to talk about decent labor. And let me connect it to the pastoral orientation on human trafficking that the section designed and wrote a couple of years ago with the collaboration of many of you that were present in Sacrofano at the consultation and at the conference. And so to start, I will start from the very beginning. And so from the Genesis, where we can find the creation, and we find work, we find labor in the creation, and the creation itself is the labor, is the work of God. And in the creation, during creation, God entrusted the care and the cultivation of earth to the creatures. So here we have the first factor, the first data, that the creation, the work, is not an absolute dominion of man over creation, but it respects the will of God and the other creatures. So work, labor cannot be an idol, cannot be a dominion, and this is the point of the original sin and of the dominion, is the exploitation of others, of the other creatures and of creation, just to stay connected to the Laudato Si. And another interesting thing is that the Sabbath rest, the rest that God has at the end of creation, is not just the worship of the creation, but for the creatures is the worship of God itself, and is the Catholic social teaching defines the rest as a defense of the poor. And if we go later in the books of the Judges and Deuteronomy, we find that the one of the sins, as the Pope Saint Pius X defined, one of the sins that cry to heaven is the injustice to the wage earner. And the Gaudium et Spes, that is the Apostolic Constitution of Paul VI, say that a wage should enable workers and their families to live above the poverty line, to have a time for rest, to enjoy life, to enjoy normal life, and to provide education and resources that are enough and sufficient for the family. So after this, we can say that indecent labor is slavery, and as Brian was saying before, we can talk about many structures, we can talk about the system, but the point is one. The principal point is the original sin. So the exploitation, the dominion over the other creatures, and and from this, the structures that the Catholic social teaching defines as a structure of sin create social and economic exclusion, and so we have an economic system that allow primacy of things over man, the priority of capital over labor and money, the technology as an end and not as a mean, and so we have all these as consequences. So this is a structure of sin, and this is the problem, and this is a problem that perpetuates without any obstacle, because it's a system that treat men, the people, as mere commodities for the self-interest of others. And so Brian said before, we have to identify a culture that's responsible for, and this could be the throwaway culture that the Pope quote many times, a culture of waste that is against the centrality of human person, the centrality of human person in the system. So the economic system, the political system, is at the service of man and not in the opposite way. And today we assist as well to in the modern era, we assist at the diversion of capitals from the real economy. And when this is excessive and there is an excessive accumulation, people are excluded, and work is an instrument and money is an end for few. So going back to the demand aspects, every one of us is a consumer and we are all involved. The Pope, I was in Geneva at the time with Michel, and the Pope said that we are all responsible for the death of people, for the exclusion of people, because we are part of this, and the common good can be reached if everyone is included, the integral human development of everyone is contemplated. So we are all parts of this, and we have the benefits of this system, a system that is involved in a conspiracy of silence for profit. And this is not far from us. It's not in big businesses, just in the Democratic Republic of Congo, very far from us, but is in our houses and in well-regarded businesses. So what I mean is, business is not connected to human trafficking or to slavery in this case, but is the place where it takes places. And every time there is where there are people that are mob, coerced, or in dire condition or dehumanizing condition, we have slavery and indecent work. So the competition in markets and the cutting of labor costs leave no choice to people to accept work in dire conditions. And with regards to consumers, Benedict XVI remembers us that in Caritas Veritate encyclical, that the purchase, the buying something is not just an economic act, but is a moral act with a specific social responsibility. And so what we can do, what can be the cure to this, is the first is the education, the culture, and must start from the beginning. Is not easy. And the second one is the business ethical assessment, because many times we hear about corporate social responsibility, but many times is a marketing it's part of marketing of public relation of a company, and there is not effective, and they still look only to efficiency. That is a different thing. And we change paradigm. We have to change paradigm, and this is what the social teaching of the church arrived in the industrial. After the Industrial Revolution, assisting to the condition of workers all around the world, and try to say something about, like, co-participation, a control on the market, on the system, but of course a free initiatives, but together, not one or the other one alone. Another thing that is a duty of, I can speak for the church, is the evangelization and the pastoral accompaniment of workers in the unions, the work of the church in unions, and also in federation of employers. And a fifth element could be the family defense, because the family is a filter to the system, is the first cell of community, and allow people to filter the system, the economic system, the cultural system, very well spread in this time with the globalization as a globalization of indifference. And this is the first weapon we must enhance and support. So more a community is fragmented, more human trafficking and slavery is possible. The individualism can grow without any obstacle, and people are not defended by the community or by family. for instance, we have indecent work, indecent labor, and slavery are not very far from us, as I said, but also in very well regarded businesses where young professionals arrived. Sometimes they finish to work very late. They don't have a life, but if they don't do that, they cannot grow. They cannot grow professionally. They have mobbed and coerced by employers. So I would like to add that slavery and indecent labor sometimes is also on voluntary basis and not only on coercion. And another thing I would like to highlight is in this time of pandemic where technology was so invasive in our life, in our work life. Technology disfigures and can disfigure work, and smart working creates strange dynamics even in decent workplaces before. And so I would like just to conclude with Saint Thomas that labor is just not a thing to I find the quotation here. I lost it. It's not just to earn money, but is part of the very nature of man. The labor is a good thing for man, a good thing for humanity, because man with work not only transform nature, adapting it to its own needs, but he also achieves fulfillment as a human being, and indeed, in a sense, become a more human being. Decent labor is a requirement for the achievement of the common good. Many thanks.
Thank you, Andreas. That was also another aspect of decent work. You spoke, like Brian, about the culture of work and about the system, but also that purchase is a moral act. So you brought another spiritual and faith-based approach to the phenomenon of decent work into the discussion. And now after we heard from you, we are going to Dr. Gabriele Spina. He's a psychologist, project manager for the consortium Il Nodo in Catania, Italy, in charge of youth protection and migrants. He will present his work to us, how they are educating young migrants to integrate into society, being able to own positions with decent work conditions, because this is not so easy. So you have the floor, Gabriele.
Thank you, Mr. Michael and Suor Miriam, to invite me to explain the job that my organization do to help the migrant. I think that my discussion is very connected with some of the topics that we talk about: the education, about the improvement of the skill and the cultural problem related with the job. I want to spend some minutes to present my organization, that is Consortium Nodo, that was born on 2000, and it is made of 10 social cooperatives that start their job in 1970. With the effort of the Good Shepherd Sister Congregation. And we work in a lot of field, principally, of course, with the migrant, unaccompanied foreign minors, adults, Italian minors also, with non-formal education in the school or in the street, and also with job policy and with some kind of difficulties like economic, social, psychological, etc. Related with the work we do with the migrant, we have in care them in the health problem, in the administrative document, and in the support, the social, economic, and psychological support. This three part in a word is integration, and 80% of the integration is related with the job, because it's very important for their integration to work in this field. We host normally 380 beneficiaries, and of these 330 are migrant, unaccompanied minors, adults, women with children, and they are hosted in 44 structures, located 99% located in condominium, and not alone, but this is the first step, very important to integrate this. For us, the condominium and the person that live in other apartment are our co-worker, and this is very important to help the guys to integrate, to understand the culture. About 6 years ago, we made a group work composed by Italian colleague and foreign colleague that are ex-beneficiary of our project, or person that don't work with us, but were ex-beneficiary that now work in other field or in NGO. And we made this group because we want to change and to create a new model of integration, because the first problem, the first need that the immigrants, the beneficiary have, is to have the document and to work. They doesn't care if the work is a work regular or irregular, with a correct salary or not. So it's very difficult, it was very difficult to involve them in activity that organize step by step the empowering of them. So the first question that we have is why beneficiary have to get up in the morning, and so we start to organize a chain of activities, laboratories, organized like a battery, 4 lessons and then exams. In a step, starting with the activity, for example, about the health, second about the domestic economy, how you can, about the health, the hygiene, the personal hygiene, the hygiene of the common space. Second, the domestic economy. I wish that you will understand me. For example, how you can manage the relationship with the roommate, with the person that live in the other apartment, how you can recycle, how you can pay the bills, etc. Another step is the civic education. Another one is the law system in Italy. And starting in this step, starting to attend at this step, and when they pass this step with the exams, we move them from the bigger structure to the smaller structure. When this part will be finished, we start with the activity of empowerment in the job. And we organize before the internship, that is normal for our activities. Before this step, we start with the work laboratory inside the consortium related with the agriculture, maintenance, electrician, restaurant, and these guys are followed by some tutor. This is like a workshop. It's not a job, but we pay them also. And we, in the same time, the tutor give them a score. So, for example, if one of the topics is the time that they have to arrive at the workshop, the second one is the dress code. The third is the effort that they put in the job, and the last one is the skill. And we gave them the score 3 to 1. And according with the score, we change the salary that we do them. When I talk about this in a social way, the person think that this kind of organization is a little bit cruel. It's not correct to use this kind of difference, because we are very straight for this. For example, if beneficiary had to arrive at 8, if he arrived at 8, you have 3. If he arrived at 8 and 1 minute, have 2. If he arrived at 8:16, he will have 1. With the score 1, they have €5 per hour. With the score 2, €3.50. With the score 1, €2.50. It's not very big because there is an algorithm that mix all the scores. So the difference normally is €50, €100, but it's very important because we noticed that at the beginning they will arrive normally not at 8, but at 8:20, 8:30, 8:40. When we start with this kind of score, they arrive right now every time 10 minutes to 8. It's not important to arrive in our project at 10 minutes to 8, but it's very important because this person have to stay in the market, and you have to are very, very empowered to because they have the competitor of the other person. So for us, it's very important. And this is a moment that where they learn a lot of cultural aspect related with the job. It's like in Italy's alphabetization. Is that they learn not only the language, but they learn how they can manage the job. This kind of activities born because our last experience is to go directly in internship outside of the consortium, and a lot of time this guy failed, but not because they are not good, but they are not ready to stay in the market. So it was very, very, very important to have this kind of activities. I don't know if I can stay at this point, and if you want, I can explain better if there is some question to explain better how our laboratory, our activities works.
Thank you, Gabriele. This was very interesting, and I heard also from what you said, the word culture also was in a lot. And I remember Brian spoke about culture, but it is a culture that we as consumers need, but the producers and the person having a position to work also need a culture which might be more regional, you know, like more where they live, and the culture of consumers should be global. So that is something what stood out for me. But we will go on with our next speaker, with Professor Marc Chesney. He is a head of Department of Banking and Finance and the Center of Competence in Sustainable Finance of the University of Zurich in Switzerland. After having been Associate Dean of HEC Paris, author of The Permanent Crisis, The Financial Oligarchy and the Failure of Democracy, for many years he has been developing a critical analysis of the financial sector and its consequences to the real economy and on the hostage-taking of democracies. Mr. Chesney, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, Michel. This evening I will focus on indecent work. Indecent, what does it mean here? Indecent, despite it guarantees a very high income, and despite it includes a very good social protections. Indecent because it is linked to cynism and bets. So we are going to focus on the other side of the coin, because there is no child labor and slavery without cynism. And so I will try to understand the context, the financial context, and what happened during the 13-year lifespan between, let's say, the bankruptcy of the bank Lehman Brothers and the scandals associated to Credit Suisse, the recent scandals. So I'm going to focus on the financial sector, and more precisely on around 30 big banks, too big to fail institutions, out of 30,000 banks. So I'm focusing on these too big to fail institutions. That is a program for this evening. So again, I will start with Lehman Brothers, and I will explain the current context, give examples of toxic finance products, of bets and cynism, and conclude on a positive note. So I will rely on my book, so chapters 2 and 4 precisely. So what happened 13 years ago with Lehman Brothers bankruptcy? It's interesting. I read the last annual report, which is still online. Very interesting. So if you have the time to have a look, you will find words such as record performance, terrific results, talent management efforts, excellence, focus on risk management. Incredible. A few months after they disappeared, they went bankrupt, but they used to focus on excellence and risk management. And this bank was supposed to, according to its yearly report, was supposed to address questions about climate change and also focus on sustainability, responsibility, philanthropy. So basically greenwashing. Regarding the rating agencies, this bank received good ratings still a few days before its bankruptcy, at least A. And the last CEO of this bank received between 2000 and 2007 around $500 million, despite his responsibility for the bankruptcy. Okay, so it was a failure of a financial analyst, basically. So I took the time to read this yearly report. It's like a puzzle. So you have to try to understand how it works, and one ratio would have been enough to understand that the situation was very dangerous. And this ratio is 50, which appears here, 50. It's the relationship between off-balance sheet activities and balance sheet activities. So basically, balance sheet activities, basically it's like an iceberg, so what you see, and off-balance sheet activities, what you hide below the table with many complex and dubious deals. So what about today now? So in a nutshell, because we don't have a lot of time, in green you have a global GDP until 2019, around $88,000 billion. In orange, you have debt, global debt, private and public debt together. Before COVID-19, it corresponded to around 300% of global GDP. Now it's at around 360% of global GDP. So that's too high. Just to be clear, it's too high. We have to be realistic. It will not be possible for companies, for all the companies and countries, to reimburse this huge level of debt. So we will be confronted, and we are already confronted, to defaults or bankruptcies. And in this kind of finance casino, there are bets. So you know, in my introduction, I spoke about cynicism. So at the same time, during which in hospitals, doctors used to fight against COVID-19, to sacrifice themselves, even physically. At the same time, you have hedge funds which are betting on the bankruptcy of companies and countries. That is cynicism, just to be clear. And what are these products? So in red here, you have so-called derivative products. As soon as you start studying finance, you will learn in textbooks that these products are useful for companies in order to hedge against financial risk, and it's true. But only a small percentage is used as hedging products, because you don't need hedging products corresponding to around 9 times global GDP. You will need hedging products corresponding maybe to 20, 30, 40% of global GDP, but not 9 times. So the remaining percentage, maybe 99%, corresponds to bets, again, on defaults and bankruptcy. So here another slide. I kept the same so global GDP, the same values here, global GDPs, debt and derivative products, and I changed the scale. And here we have the scale of the financial transactions, simply huge, around 150 times the GDP. So it's so huge. I mean, everything, all the transactions, all the electronic transactions, is so huge that if this level, this volume of electronic transactions would be considered as a tax basis, a micro tax of around 0.1% would be enough to get rid of the VAT, for example, and to help many families in Switzerland and in many countries. Okay, let me move forward with financial products, just to give you an idea in a nutshell. According to the SIX, so the exchange in Switzerland, we have here weekly data related to derivatives. Second week of October 2020. I know it's late and I'm not going to go into detail. But what you see here around equity, I hope you see my mouse, equity here. So derivatives on equity, so on stock prices, basically. The volume corresponds to, here, what you see here, between 18 and 19 billion of Swiss francs, only for Switzerland. So in other words, if you compare that to the GDP, to the Swiss GDP, it corresponds to 26,000 times the Swiss GDP. I repeat, 26,000 times the Swiss GDP. Why is it so huge? And again, the answer is simple, because a huge amount here corresponds to bets and cynicism. Move forward. What about today? So we know the situation here. I have some data about the two big banks in Switzerland, but the situation is similar abroad, in the US, in Germany, in England, in France. Off-balance sheet activities, derivatives are huge. So they corresponded in 2019 for Credit Suisse to 26 times the size of the balance sheet, around 30 times the Swiss GDP for one bank. These bets correspond to 30 times the size of the country, and around 25% of global GDP. Similar for UBS, same kind of situations. So these bets represent 25% of world GDP and 30 times the size of Swiss GDP. It's interesting because if you are a taxpayer in Switzerland, you might be interesting to be aware of the risk of so-called too big to fail institutions. Now, what is new today is a shadow banking sector. It existed 13 years ago, but now it's much stronger. So what does it mean? It means financial institutions without banking license. So for example, BlackRock is not a bank, but it's very strong, much stronger than 13 years ago. Now, talking about Credit Suisse, you know what happened a few weeks ago. Huge bets of Credit Suisse with two hedge funds, basically Archegos and Greensill. The bets corresponded to around 50% of the capital of the bank, 50%. And so 20 billion Swiss francs and 5 billion well lost. And it's not finished. So now, just to be concrete in the last minutes of my presentation, I would like to give an example of these bets which are off balance sheet. A CDS, a credit default swap. I presume most of you don't know what it is, so allow me to start from scratch and to explain what it is. If you Google, you will find this definition. A CDS is a derivative product that allows its owner to protect himself against the risk of default of a reference entity. So just to give you an example here, on this graph, you see a bank gives a loan to a company, an amount X, for example, 10 million Swiss francs. Between the company and an insurance company, you have always insurance contracts. And if this company here on the right-hand side is, let's say, a restaurant, a company linked to restaurants or hotels, tourism, let's assume it might be the case that the bank gave the loan, for example, here before COVID-19, and during COVID-19, the bank fears that the company might go bankrupt. So the bank will buy a CDS, a credit default swap, to the insurance company. So for example, if the company gives back only, let's say, 3 million instead of 10 million, the bank will activate its CDS. The CDS corresponds in my example to 10 million Swiss francs, and the bank will receive the difference, 7 million Swiss francs. So far so good. A CDS is useful. It's an insurance contract. Now, if you read if you dig deeper in Google, you will find this comment. It is not necessary to actually be exposed to the reference entity's risk in order to enter into a CDS contract. So I try to explain and to translate. It means that it is not necessary for a company to be exposed to risk in order to hedge. So what does it mean? If I don't own a car, why should I be allowed to buy a car insurance? So in this example, despite the fact I don't have a car, I would be allowed to buy a car insurance. Not on my car because I have no car, but maybe on the car of the neighbor because I know he drives poorly. He might have an accident. So given that nothing is regulated for CDS, for cars, obviously it's forbidden. Otherwise, we'd have many accidents. But here in this case, CDS, it's allowed. So if it would be allowed for cars, then I would have incentives maybe to identify the neighbor who drives very poorly, and to invite him before he drives to give him a glass of alcohol to make sure he will have an accident. And I will not buy only one so-called car insurance, but 10, 20, 100. It's not regulated. So here, again, for cars, it's forbidden, and it's good. For CDSs in the financial sector, it's still allowed today, 2021. So you have huge bets, again, on the bankruptcy of companies. And it creates a systemic risk. So at the end of the day, you know, in my example, the bank will buy, instead of buying one CDS on the company for 10 million Swiss francs, will buy maybe 10 CDSs on, so 10 times 10, 100 billion Swiss francs. Why? The bank is exposed only to a maximum risk of 10 billion Swiss francs, not 1 million. At the end of the day, the bank will make a huge profit if the company goes bankrupt. Finally, one of these companies might go bankrupt, and given that they are too big to fail, the taxpayer will pay the bill. By the way, it's not liberalism, it's something different, because the first principle of liberalism is very simple. If you engage in risky activities, you assume risks. And here it's not the case, given that the taxpayer assumes risks. The social impacts are huge. So here you have the income distribution. What do we see? Nothing, basically, because we have an horizontal line here for 99.99% of the population. And on the vertical axis here, you have the remaining 0.01%. And here I wrote regarding the income, not in million, but in billion dollars or Swiss francs. So Jeff Bezos, for example, Amazon, Jeff Bezos on July 20th received 13 billion, not million, 13 billion Swiss francs in one day. The first time in the history that one person was allowed to be richer of 13 billion dollars. It corresponds in one day to twice what 1.3 billion Africans received on the same day. It corresponds also to 10 times the value of the Castle of Versailles. 10 times, not in 50 years, as it was the case with the Castle of Versailles, in one day. So we have to be aware of that, of the other side of the coin. And we are confronted with a disconnection between the financial sector in red here and the real economy in green. So here you have stock prices for the biggest companies in the US in red, and the earnings of the same companies. And what you see here, simply a disconnection, which is due to what? To the monetary policy of central banks. They inject huge amount of money in the financial sector, hoping that the financial sector will give loans to the real economy. It's not really the case. And instead of observing really an inflation in the real economy, it might come, but today still quiet. We observe an inflation in the financial sector, meaning that stock prices keep increasing. Okay, now let's talk again about decent work, and let me give you very precise examples of some traders. Mr. Jérôme Kerviel, who used to work for Société Générale in Paris, he went to jail because he was accused of a loss of 4.9 billion euros in 2007. And the police took his emails. Let me give you an example of what he wrote. In a trading room, the ideal modus operandi can be summed up in one phrase: knowing how to take the maximum risk to gain the bank the maximum money. In the name of such a rule, the most elementary principles of caution don't count for much. In the midst of the great banking orgy, traders have the same consideration as any average prostitute: the quick acknowledgement that today's paycheck was good. Example number 2, Mr. Touré, who used to work for Goldman Sachs, and the process was organized in New York against Goldman Sachs, who sold dubious products to its clients. The police took his emails again. I quote, "There is more and more leverage in the system, so more and more debt. The whole building might collapse at any time. When I think there was a little of me in the creation of this product, he means here derivatives, bets, the kind of thing you invent, saying to yourself, what about creating a machine that serves no purpose at all, that is totally conceptual and highly theoretical, and that nobody knows how to price? It is bad for the head to watch it implode in full flight. It is a little like Frankenstein turning against his inventor." Third example, Mr. Polk, a former trader who wrote various articles in the New York Times, and I quote, "Not only was I not helping to fix any problems in the world, but I was profiting from them. Cynism. In my last year on Wall Street, my bonus was $3.6 million. And I was angry because it wasn't big enough. I was 30 years old, had no children to raise, no debts to pay, no philanthropic goal in mind. I wanted more money for exactly the same reason an alcoholic needs another drink. I was addicted." So in a nutshell, three examples. The first one compares himself to a prostitute. The second one to Frankenstein. And the third one says he's addicted. Let me show you a last example, a former director of Goldman Sachs, who left this bank, and he explained why. "Today is my last day at Goldman Sachs. After almost 12 years at the firm, I believe I've worked here long enough to understand the trajectory of its culture, its people, and its identity. And I can honestly say that the environment now is as toxic and destructive as I have ever seen it. To put the problem in the simplest terms, the interests of the client continue to be sidelined in the way the firm operates and thinks about making money. Cynism." Conclusion. So it's not only the bankruptcy of a bank, namely Lehman Brothers, it's a bankruptcy of a system of casino finance in which debts bets and cynicism prevail over saving, investment, and trust. This process plunges society into a permanent crisis. Too big to fail institutions, so big banks, around 30 big banks and hedge funds, by the way, enjoy all sorts of advantages and guarantees, so state guarantees, basically, that contrast starkly with the liberal principles they proclaim. And last but not least, obviously there are solutions, because I want everybody to be able to sleep this evening. And I want to conclude on a positive note. I mean, there are many solutions. For example, in order to make sure there is no toxic financial products, a certification process would be useful. It is the case in most of the branches, of the sectors, car industry, pharma industry. Why not in the financial industry? And etc. Micro tax, we spoke about that. Macro tax on electronic payments, 0.6. The volume of electronic transactions is so huge that a micro tax would be enough to get rid of various taxes. Economic and finance courses should be adapted. I mean, we should draw lessons of what happened in 2000. Professors, of what happened in 2008 and after. If you compare the program of courses, basically in 2006, 7, 8, and now, you will see differences, but not enough. So it's a responsibility of professors to make sure we draw lessons. Finally, separation of retail and investment banks. The President Roosevelt introduced in 1933 the so-called Glass-Steagall Act, so to separate again investment banks from retail banks, and it worked because we had much less banking crisis in particular after World War II until 1999. This act was repealed by President Clinton, unfortunately. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor. I want to read the last comment of the chat box, because it's exactly what I think. Mr. Sommer says, "Thanks for a most interesting and shocking presentation." So there is a lot of new content, and it's quite shocking. Yeah. Thank you. Now, I invite the participants of the webinar to raise questions. We have already 3 questions in the Q&A box, so I will slowly start with them, but you are invited to add more questions or comments, and we will come to them. So the first question is from Isabel Smith, and she asks, "Do you have hope from the work of Fair Phone and Fair Tech?" Who would like to answer, to say something?
Well, Miriam, we are aware of the work of Fairphones because they're one of the players in DRC. They're trying hard to pull together all the actors to improve the responsibility of the supply chain of batteries. I have to say, I personally am a little bit skeptical because in the absence of a strong partnership with the public agencies that need to be fully engaged for enforcement of rules on one hand, but also to provide decent alternatives on the other end, what this operations can do is to work with the symptoms and not with the causes, if I can say. It's a bit of a difficult concept, but a lot of the operations that are looking at standards and how to implement standards in supply chains are very much focused on the symptoms. And so we take the children out of the mines, we put the hats on top of the heads of the miners, and we take a nice picture, and we make sure in our blockchain system the flag is there in the checkbox. But the bigger picture is that without infrastructures, without services, without social protection systems, these standards are not realistically enforced.
Thank you very much. Okay, if nobody else is for this, we have the next question. Ms. Patricia Miriam Isimat asks and says, corruption is the main problem. So what are the plans against corruption? Somebody wants to comment? Okay, so maybe we come back to it later. So there is a comment. Oops. There's a comment. Thank you very much to Professor Chesney for this very interesting contribution. There's a lot to do, and I wonder if, at least in Switzerland, FINMA will be up to its responsibility.
I'm sorry, what is FINMA?
I don't. FINMA? I don't. You are muted.
Sorry, FINMA. I hope, but it's not really the case today, because the FINMA should check the quality of these financial products, but still allows the diffusion of these products today. So there are financial products, there are toxic financial products today that clients can buy, and they lose a lot of money. So FINMA should be much more active here and should check whether or not these products, what these products mean, if they are useful for the economy, for the society. If yes, they should be allowed. If not, they should not. And you know, I mean, same thing for medicines. If we are confronted with toxic medicines, obviously it should be forbidden, and that should be the same thing with financial products. But it's not the case, unfortunately.
Thank you. We have another question. I believe that local populations need some legal assistance to educate them about their rights and assist them in negotiating terms of work so that they are not exploited by unscrupulous businesses. How can we ensure that such assistance could be provided?
Well, just briefly, Miriam, this is definitely part of what we do and what other NGOs do. It's a key component of our intervention to educate people on their rights as citizens and as workers.
Yeah, thank you. So, and I think you spoke already about this, Cristina, because you are providing this. You know, NGOs are providing it, but of course it is also a systemic problem, obviously. Now, there is the next question. Could Andrea Marchesani react from the point of view of the Vatican to Professor Chesney's presentation, giving some insight of the social teaching on that?
It is a pleasure, and I would like to quote. I would like to mention that Caritas in Veritate encyclical by Benedict XVI was there were many parts on this issue of the problems of the regularization and the anarchy, if I can use this word, that is in financial system. So the problem is, Pope Benedict said this, that when everything become subservient to existing economic and financial system, and they don't correct the dysfunctional aspects. And in 2018, my dicastery, the dicastery for integral for integral human development, together with the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Church, issued a document that is the Latin name is Economiche and Pecuniarie Questiones, and there is a chapter on this. And if I may, we can synthesize saying that it starts with, like I said before, the money is a good instrument to one's freedoms and expand one's possibility, but it can easily turn against men. So the financial dimension of the business world, with the access to the stock exchange of companies, can have negative consequences. Virtual wealth, mainly characterized by speculative transaction, attracts indeed excessive amounts of capital diverted from circulation within the real economy. Capital accumulation is gradually transforming work into instruments and money into a hand. The result is the spread of a culture of waste, marginalizing great masses and depriving them of decent labor. So basically, I cannot add very much on this part. The Pope, I don't want to make comparisons, but Professor Chesney and the magisterium of the church spoke on this issue many times in history, and since the first encyclical of Leo XIII, the Rerum Novarum, and all the social documents of the church, we can focus all these modern phenomenon, like the phenomena we had before 2 centuries ago, are they correspond to the same logic. Today I would like to say that I see that there is a escalation of power because of not only for technology, but because everything is not many things are not real and are in the web, are in a system that you cannot touch. And if before the problems were in the real economy, today we assist to a different phenomenon that is much more powerful and much more difficult to control.
Thank you. There's another question to Professor Chesney. With the potential revenue on microtaxes on transactions, what is your read? Why it is not implemented? Because the discussion on it is not new.
Sorry, precisely, it is new. It is new. There is not this huge amount of transaction didn't exist 1 century ago, even not 50 years ago. It is new. It corresponds to 150 times the GDP. So I think something new. Let's say it started 30, 40 years ago, something like that, with the so-called financialization of the economy, meaning that the financial sector is in a position to take the power. And that is something new again. It was not the case 200 years ago. So to impose its logic to the economy and to the society. So it's new because, again, this volume is huge. And because it's not the so-called Tobin tax, people might have heard about that. Because here with Tobin, the idea was to focus on specific transactions, on stock transactions or currency transactions. Here, the idea of the micro tax is to consider all electronic transactions without exception. So between banks, with clients, if you go to a restaurant, hairdresser, whatever, ATM, whatever, everything with the same rate, 0.1%, something like that, very small, micro. So that's simple. I mean, technically very simple, politically very delicate issue, because obviously, if most of the bank could agree, I say could agree because we wrote in the document that banks would be paid for such a work. So if they collect money, tax money, they should keep a given percentage, so they will be paid. So for small banks, it could make sense. For big banks, it would be different because they rely on the so-called high frequency trading, meaning that they buy and sell stocks at milli or microseconds, just to be clear. So obviously they will pay more tax. They would pay more tax with a micro tax than us. But most of the people and most of the company would pay less. So it would be an advantage for, let's say, 99% of the population and of the companies. But the remaining 1%, here we're talking about too big to fail institutions, is obviously against this kind of idea. Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to inform you that Cristina Duranti had to leave. We have some questions regarding Kolbesi, but there's also, it's connected again to the situation of corruption. You know, the work towards decent work in Kolbesi, in a country where most things don't work, where corruption is the main problem. How to improve the working conditions in that situation with such corruption? I want to give also an input or an idea, because I was living in a country with a high corruption, and I was not used to it, and I got a cultural explanation what I found very interesting. It was a country where for, you can say, 500, 1600 years, no, there was occupation, there was a dictatorship. The people learned not to trust the government. So to survive, they needed to trust the family. And that if the governance of a country changed to democracy, conflicts, because after so many 500 years, you can't change the mentality, you can't change the saying inside the people, well, so the government is not on our side, and I think this could cause corruption. So this is an idea I have on it, but I wouldn't give a lecture. I don't know if you could relate to this, or if this could help to think about how to deal with corruption in these poor countries. So if not, it's okay. I think maybe my approach might be interesting for some of the people asking about corruption. Then we have a question. I'm not surprised that Pope Francis has written, "This economic kills," as we are all complicit in this toxic system, as we use the banks and perhaps don't ask any questions of our banking system. Mr.
Yes, we should ask questions and try to understand the problems, obviously, because we are citizens and we have also responsibility as citizens to try to understand the complexity. The system is too complex. We have to simplify it, obviously.
A question about systemic change. At some point in history, the evolution of economy derotated so that today modern slavery and indecent work is possible and in some way profitable. Clients are used to cheap products, and people with little income may not be able to afford to pay fair trade products. Medium-sized companies may need to reduce production or labor costs to stay competitive. They may be in the dilemma not to be able to offering decent work. What would be the starting point to change the whole system?
That's like asking the answer to life, the universe, and everything. That's the very big question, right? 42, I think, is the right answer, by the way. So, you know, tackling this question is exactly why I started slave-free trade, right? So when I go back 20 years ago, working on a slavery case, on my first forced labor case and child labor case, was actually a 12-year-old boy shot in the head and dumped overboard from a prawn boat. Now, one of the interesting things I found from that investigation was that the prawns from the boat the boy was on, he and two friends were shot and killed for those prawns. The prawns sold at the first point of sale for the same price as the prawns from a boat next door, where it was a family boat and everybody was treated well. There is no differentiation from the very first point of sale to the end. slave-free and slave-made are not a different price. The market, the value chain is completely blind to the conditions under which things are made. So it's not about cheap. It's not about expensive. A high-end luxury brand scarf can be made with as much forced labor or child labor as a $14 scarf. It just has a 4,000% markup. So we're not talking about, so I would say divorce yourself from the idea that it's about cheap. The $14 t-shirt is still a $14 t-shirt if everybody in that value chain gets what they should be paid. If you break down the contribution to the value of the $14 t-shirt to the labor costs involved in making it, you could triple the salaries of the people who are making the t-shirt and have no obvious effect on the $14 price tag at the other end. And let's also consider that of the $14, 61% is going to the H&M or Zara, whoever they are, right? So even if they had to cut themselves to 60.2%, you could still triple the wages of everybody involved in making the shirt. So it's not about the cheap things only. That's not a big issue. What we need to do is incentivize the bringing together, the coming together of human rights and the bottom line, so that your bottom line becomes dependent on human rights. Because otherwise we have the same situation that we would have in the financial industry, which is that people have no moral compass. And unless we make their bottom line human rights dependent, they're not going to change. I mean, you look at the bankers that are doing the things that Professor Chesney was talking about. I mean, these people are crap. They're doing dreadful, toxic things. They've lost their moral compass. They have no conscience. What they care about is money. So we have to forget about the intrinsic good. We can't talk about the intrinsic good to these people. What we need to be saying is that your bottom line, because we've got CEOs, shareholders, government legislation, consumers, investment management firms, we've got all of these stakeholders saying human rights is now part of your bottom line. Get it right or we don't buy from you. Public procurement agencies have a key role to play in the same thing, right? So bringing all these demand actors together, these target audiences together, investors, public procurement firms, government agencies, legal firms, consumers, bringing them all together to do their little bit to push demand is the only thing we can do. We need to join up demand, because at the moment demand is completely disaggregated. Even from one consumer to another, demand is completely aggregated. H&M, they do a great job of dividing consumers. This is what they do. That's part of the business model. So that the consumers never come together against H&M in any kind of numbers that make a difference to them. So joining up all the actors who can provide demand on this, and it's the same in the finance world, this will be the only thing that creates change, to be frank. Bring the human rights and the bottom line together so that the bottom line is dependent on human rights performance. That's where we need to go. And it's big, right? That's 42.
Thank you. I don't know why, but I have another name now, but I'm here. And as it's working. So now there's another question, and it said in Germany, there has been a political initiative called Lieferkettenschutzgesetz. That means it is a protection law for supply chains. Do you think that this could be a model for further change? Yeah, Brian, go. Mut.
There we go. Yeah, so the new German supply chain due diligence law has come out, along with France has had one for a long time. Norway just did one. Many countries are developing them. They're a very important part of one of these, what I mentioned before, demand drivers, right? So suddenly, 90% of businesses that the German government themselves said were not human rights compliant companies, they have a law now that the German government can potentially use to push them in the right direction. We get told quite often by people within companies who want to see change that there is a need for a law because they, within their company, don't have the power to bring the company along. They point to it and say, well, we need a law because then we can go to our CEO and say, we need a law, there's a law. And so they kind of need support within companies to be able to bring the company along. Shareholders can start to mobilize around laws like this. Bad scandals and bad publicity comes from when there's a law. Breaking a law is much more serious than an ethical break. So the law is important as a single piece of a very large puzzle of demand that forces businesses in the right direction. That's what I would say about that.
Thank you. I think it is time to wrap up. I would like, there are two questions, and I think they are the questions of the world, and maybe everybody of you could say one sentence to answer it, because with this you will answer all the problems. So the first question is, what needs to happen and where are the roadblocks? One sentence. Whoever wants to start.
Okay, let me jump in. Demand is completely unfunded and underfunded. 98, 99% of money spent on modern slavery and human trafficking is spent on supply side initiatives, wiping up spilt milk. You've got to do that in any kind of a treatment regime. But ultimately, we're not curing anything by doing that. Demand is where we need to go. And it's completely unfunded. I had to fund slave-free trade from my own savings. It's just ridiculous.
Thank you.
If I may, like Brian said, demand. So the problem of demand is we have to change the paradigm, and so we need education. What I said before, the cure is education, is evangelization on Catholic perspective, and the family empowerment. Because if we empower family, we empower workers, and through family pass education, and so the system is, everything is connected, and it's not an easy thing, but we have to work on this, I think.
Thank you. So, okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. You're mute. Yeah.
I'm sorry. It's okay. Money should be perceived as not as an end in itself, but as means to be happy, but not as an end in itself. Otherwise, it's a sickness.
Gabriele, one conclusion. What? Yes.
I don't know if I can answer this question because my level is very, very low. But I think, as Andrea says, that it's very important, the culture, the empowerment of the guys that are critical, consume. If you have to spend money, how you can spend money? Of course, it doesn't change the situation, the financial situation that Marc explained, of course, but in our small life, to understand a little bit of this mechanism is important to be awareness and try in our little activities to change some very little piece.
Thank you.
If I may add a thing, I would like just to say that labor is for men and not men for labor. And so what we see today, that many people are that they voluntarily get coerced by themselves or by their work because they want to reach something, and we can call that self-realization, success, all of these. but what we are called in this life is the realization of is our realization through the relations with others, not through ourselves and not through our labor.
Thank you. And with that, I hand over to Michel to wrap up the webinar.
Good evening. I would like to really express my gratitude to all speakers and participants. We had up to 122 participants from more than 45 countries. My special gratitude goes to Yves Reichenbach, our webmaster, and also to my assistant in Geneva, Clara Izeppi, and my assistants in Nice, Pepita Alemani and Roman Diaz. The video recording of this webinar shall be available in a few days on our website at laudato.si.org, with subtitles in English, French, German, Italian, Russian, Spanish, and Chinese. And feel free to share the link. Our English online course on human trafficking for helpers is now on the way to be translated into French. I wish you the best. I invite you to our upcoming webinars in September on human rights and human trafficking, in October on refugees and human trafficking, in November on migrants and human trafficking, and in December on religions against human trafficking. We are also considering additional webinars on specific issues dealing with human trafficking. We shall keep you informed. Thank you again, and best wishes to all. Goodbye now.